Welcome back to Adam's Fall. The following is a conversation I had with Risto. He's an evangelical. He's incredibly nice and insightful and a good conversation partner. And in this series of episodes, we are going to focus on C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And there are 4 books in Mere Christianity, and we're going to do 4 episodes, and we will focus on what really is mere Christianity and also contrast C.S. Lewis's beliefs with LDS beliefs. Join us for these episodes where we explore what is at the base of Christianity. We look forward to your comments and suggestions, and please subscribe and like if you haven't done so already.
Welcome back, everybody, to an episode of Adam's Fall. Today I've got my main man, Risto, who's an evangelical, and we've had a conversation before. And in that conversation, we talked about our experience with Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism in terms of our experience attending Mass in the liturgy. And in this episode, we're going to dive into something a little different, and that is C.S. Lewis. And I think you've been, really diving into C.S. Lewis recently yourself. What have you been looking into or reading in regards to C.S. Lewis?
Well, I grew up. My mom read the Chronicles of Narnia to us when we were kids a few times. So, like every good evangelical, that was like par for the course. And then I think I had read Mere Christianity or been assigned Mere Christianity when I was in college. And to be honest, I think I did read it, but I don't remember anything about it. I didn't particularly love it. So, and then I read his space trilogy. So most of my experience was with his fiction. But recently, this past year, I read The Abolition of Man, which is pretty short, but it's pretty heady. It's pretty in depth. It's 3 chapters. So I had to take it slow. And I don't even know what inspired me to read The Abolition of Man. But I found it really interesting and applicable for like where we are as a society. And then I started to think, I grew up in like you said, an evangelical household, a Christian household. I attended the Church of the Nazarene. But maybe I'm going through my spiritual midlife crisis right now. I'm kind of re-asking myself, like, what does it mean to be a Christian, and do I want to be one? So part of that first question is like, what does it mean to be a Christian? A book entitled Mere Christianity seems like it's probably going to address someone's perspective on what that is. And since I knew I liked C.S. Lewis, I was like, oh, I should check that out. So it'd been on my, like, in the back of my mind. And then I think my wife brought it up, and my sister-in-law brought it up, and then all of a sudden I just started hearing people talk about it, and I was already planning on reading it, so I was like, well, I'm just going to dive in. So I've been reading it at the same time as my brother. He's been reading Mere Christianity, and then I was reading it with a few friends in the Mormon ex-Mormon community who I interact with online. So that's been interesting to hear their perspective as well. But mostly my desire was just like personally, like for myself, just to hear what Lewis had to say.
Yeah, I don't know when the first time I read Mere Christianity was. Quite a while ago, and I'm not even sure why I read it. I read the Chronicles of Narnia like you did when I was a teenager. I was just big into fantasy, so I read J.R. Tolkien and on different fantasy authors. And Chronicles of Narnia is when I kind of read fairly early on in my teenage years. Really loved it, of course. I think it was in my 20s I probably read Mere Christianity. probably just because C.S. Lewis was, somebody who I really respected. I knew he wrote religious texts as well. You could argue Chronicle of Narnia is, of course, the religious text, but formal religious texts that are focused on Christianity. So I was kind of interested in that. So I've read Mere Christianity, I don't know, 2 or 3 times, I would say. And then several of his other books. So you mentioned one of those I've read before as well. So, and once you've read Mere Christianity, if you're in the right headspace, it's so intriguing and interesting. I found C.S. Lewis just to come at things from a different angle, not so much polemical or he's trying to promote a specific denomination. When you grow up in the Latter-day Saint church, you're used to, when you're dealing with other Christians, that it's really about, Bible bashing, as we used to call it, just competing over verses and, you're wrong, we're right. And I was an LDS missionary, so you were doing a lot of that too. We're actually preaching as well. So you kind of, he brings a new flavor to it that is trying to transcend denominational battles. And his insights are also incredible. So when you read not just Mere Christianity, but just his thoughts on human life and insights into life, to me, have been very insightful. And so, I was intrigued about the opportunity to visit with you. I know you've been reading C.S. Lewis recently, so we decided why not we cover a little bit of Mere Christianity. And my thought is that we do one book at a time. So I think there's 4 books in Mere Christianity, so we can have a 4-part episode. And because there's so much material in each one of these things that really it would be a disservice to do an 8-hour stream on just the whole book at once. And really the first book has some interesting things, especially if you're going to talk about how LDS beliefs differ from C.S. Lewis. These really come to a fore immediately in this book. So there's some interesting differences where you might ask, well, what is Mere Christianity, and is the Church of Jesus Christ or LDS fall under his definition of Mere Christianity that he's already beginning to outline in the first book? So I thought we might just kind of go through some of the summary of the preface and some of the chapters. Does that work for you? I just pull some of that up and maybe we dive into that, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that sounds good. And you mentioned the preface. Well, before you, it ties into the preface, but you mentioned like Lewis, that you read him even as a Latter-day Saint. And I think we've talked about this before. He's been quoted quite a bit in General Conference, the large gathering in the LDS Church. And I heard recently Orthodox love C.S. Lewis, or at least some Orthodox, and Catholics and Evangelicals. So like all these different groups really like C.S. Lewis. And I think that's partially because I think he had some profound stuff to say. Like his background was as a skeptic, as an atheist, but who's trained in philosophy and literature. So he really kind of understood at a high level, but then could bring it down for everyday normal people. And then, which I think we'll get into this as we go through Mere Christianity, but I think the foundation wasn't so much that he joined a certain Christian team, and there's different Christian teams, which we've already talked about, but it was that he had an experience with Christ. So his Christianity was a little bit mystical and experiential. And he'll talk about it some in the preface, he kind of tended to want to stay away from like the team fighting, which maybe makes him why he's so popular. Like I think of an analogy of like baseball. Like someone could just have totally fallen in love with baseball and love playing baseball, versus someone who's just like a diehard New York Yankees fan. So if they're just constantly just talking about the Yankees and how the Yankees are the best team and all the other teams suck, then it kind of can be that's kind of like ostracizing for even other baseball fans. But if someone's just talking about their love of baseball and how they're really into that, I think that can bring more people in and they can relate to that. So I see C.S. Lewis as kind of like that latter example.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it, in that C.S. Lewis would be more thinking about what common things make baseball good in general, rather than just one specific team good. Are there common things that unite fans on different teams? Are there common things that make baseball interesting to certain people? Are there common values, moral laws, you could say, about baseball? Rules that come from above. And so I think that's an interesting comparison. I like that. So I think I'll just bring up, I'm going to cheat here and share my screen, and actually used ChatGPT to come up with some things that are good reminders. I think they're pretty good, actually, in terms of just giving us a format for going through some of the material. Now, just as a background to Mere Christianity, Lewis goes into how it originated as a series of radio talks he gave during World War II. So that's an interesting part about it, is it didn't originate with him trying to write a book formally. There was a set of talks, and then he gathered those and put them together as Mere Christianity. And like you said, it clarifies that his goal was not to promote one particular Christian denomination, but to focus on the core beliefs held in common. So that would be the core things, like in the baseball example, I guess you were using, that are in common between the different teams. By all Christians, he says, in what he calls, quote, Mere Christianity, use the image, and I like this when I read this initially years and years ago, that he used the image of a hallway with many doors leading to different rooms, denominations. His goal is to bring people into the hallway, the Christian faith, but not to push them into a specific room. So I think he also talks about that he's not a theologian. He didn't write this book to be as a theologian. He was talking about how other people are much better suited for that. People that are professionals should be the theologians, but really his goal was to defend the essence of the Christian faith, not to deal with controversial, divisive issues. So he talks a good deal about, in the preface, how he avoided certain particular issues, maybe perpetual virginity or Mary would be one example, in relation to Catholic beliefs, and that he wanted to more focus, instead of on issues like that, more on things that unite all Christians as he defines Christianity. And if you needed more specialization, that where you would go to the theologian, for example. So I don't know if you had anything else on that.
Yeah, that preface was actually hit me, quite a bit. I think the preface could be one of the most important pieces of the book for online Christian interactions these days. I think Lewis says his recommendation is that Christians shouldn't debate these kind of like small theological things, or not necessarily small, but like technical, maybe second order theological aspects in public, which is kind of like don't fight with your family in public sort of thing. And I liked his perspective on that. I think that it's an interesting thing I've kind of been pondering, is like these days there's so many like Christian debates that just kind of that blow up, especially as we start interacting more with different traditions, whether it's the Trinity debate that's popular right now between LDS and credo Christians, or the big one is also like, do Muslims worship the same God? And the Catholics are saying, some of the Catholics are saying yes, and some of the Orthodox are saying no, and they're fighting about it. And Lewis's take would be that I think, one, it should be done respectfully, And two, if there's going to be a big debate about it, it should be maybe in private.
Yeah, I like that. That really is a very important facet of Lewis's thought in Mere Christianity. Is there are all sorts of these little things that seem to define different denominations, but can we get at a commonality in Christianity? And I think he spends a good amount of time in this first book trying to define a little bit about what he sees as some elements that are common in Christianity. And there are going to be some differences, actually, about how he defines Christianity in this first book than actually an LDS view. So I think that'd be interesting to highlight, even though those might be some of those small issues. you could think that too. But he kind of lays them out as a foundational element, so I'm not so sure they are small in the context of this book, because he kind of lays this out as a substrate for the rest of the book. And if you disagree on some of these things, then how does the rest of the book fare? So I think it'll be interesting to explore some of those things. Not that I wish to really hone in on those, but maybe so we can define what we might see as mere Christianity. There may be some differences there as well. So,
well, perhaps maybe we could do this. Maybe I could have a 5-minute opening statement. You could have a 5-minute opening statement, and then we can cross-examine each other.
That's right.
No, I'm just kidding. I think we can just have a dialogue about it.
We can get into the debate. Well, I also have just a summary of chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. This is what comprises book 1. And so I'll just briefly review each of these. So in chapter 1, the law of human nature, he spends a good amount of time talking about how when people are just routinely talking to each other, there seems to be this unwritten rule that they are abiding by. When somebody takes somebody's candy or does something to another person, there seems to be this just automatic standard that people appeal to, and he calls this the law of human nature. It seems to be universal, and his thought is that the differences that are often put out there between different groups of people about what they view as the law of human nature, or morals, so to speak, is actually the differences are not as great as they're made out to be. And there are a lot of common elements between different cultures. And, in terms of bravery, for example, I think he uses the example of, soldier being brave in battle or cowardly. Those seem to be pretty universal. But there's a lot of other examples you can point to. And he also addresses in chapter 2 some of the objections, such as morality just being a social convention. And like I said, he kind of touches base on while customs may differ, the underlying moral principles are remarkably consistent. I think this is where critics may sometimes disagree. Are they as consistent as he puts forth in this section? I don't think he goes into too much depth on that, trying to justify that terribly well, in my opinion. But
no, he points you to the abolition of man for further exploration of that, and I think it's maybe the appendix of the abolition of man, where, and I don't know if Lewis did this work or someone else, but I don't know if you got a chance to look at that, but he lists out the different cultures and different moral laws that they hold in common. So he actually goes into detail there.
Yeah, good point. Chapter 3, the reality of the law. So moral law is not the same as natural laws like gravity. So he does spend quite a bit of time in that section going through different laws, how we have no choice in regards to gravity, just like a rock is always going to fall. There are things that happen in nature that will always be obeyed. There's no way out of it. And so those are called the natural laws we would normally associate with in the universe. But unlike these physical, normal, natural laws that we all know about, when we choose to disobey a moral law, there's not this automatic process that happens. And he suggests that there is this lawgiver, something outside, like as behind the universe, that is providing these laws, and that are different than the physical laws, which have an automatic consequence that is inescapable. And chapter 4, he focuses on that the moral law implies a moral lawgiver and to a mind or intelligence behind the universe. In chapter 5, that God is good and just, and we break the law, we're in trouble, and that recognizing the reality of the moral law and God makes people uncomfortable. So it's a touchy subject in many circles, of course, that, really do we need God to have a moral law? And this is where the sticking points get a little bit between LDS theology and, conventional Christian thought. So that's where we'll have some fruitful discussions, I'm sure. But any other thoughts on just the chapters in general, or your feelings about them?
Yeah, it's, I think I asked myself, why did he start here? In the title for this first book is Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. So, and I think Lewis does his apologetics quite a bit different than classical Christian apologetics, even though he's touching on some similar topics, it's a common argument for God is the moral argument for God. And I'm not sure that Lewis he's kind of doing that here, but I think also not really. But then another common argument might be from the resurrection, like the historicity of the resurrection. But Lewis is kind of, I think he can tell that his audience is going to be a little bit skeptical of a theist position. And so if you just bring up the resurrection, a lot of people might balk at that, or miracles. It's easy to question, well, did that really happen? That seems really fantastical that someone would be raised from the dead. But so I think Lewis starts as something that's kind of like close to home, which is our sense of right and wrong, and especially in relation to World War II, it was, pretty strong. You could see Hitler and go, that's wrong. Well, is that always wrong? Well, maybe it is always wrong to do what Hitler did. And I think he's using that to say, if you believe that there is a moral right and wrong that's for all time, then that's above the natural world. It's above physics. It's supernatural. So I think this is maybe Lewis's way to smuggle in the supernatural, or to make people say, what is the nature of the universe? Is it just atoms bumping around, or is it something more? And then he's using that moral law to I think try and demonstrate that people already think it is something more.
Yeah, those are great points. I think the World War II obviously had a huge impact on him. And when you face that kind of evil, it makes you think, are there moral laws that are both good and evil, that are transcendent, that are eternal? And he was in part reflecting on that in this discussion. And he definitely highlights that quite a bit throughout the book. It was, it's very pertinent now. We still talk about that to this day. I can't imagine how, fresh in their minds that was at this time. So now I wanted to bring up, what are some criticisms of Lewis here in book 1. And one of them is that the universal law of nature is it really a shared sense of right and wrong across all cultures? So critics will often, like anthropologists and so forth, will cite that moral norms differ significantly across cultures and time periods, making it difficult to claim a truly universal standard. So this is one of the obvious things that he tried to discuss in the book. is that maybe there weren't so many differences as we were thinking. Now, this is going to be a subjective kind of evaluation at some point. What are major differences? What are minor differences? And so apparent moral agreement may be superficial, while deeper values, we can often point to justice, gender roles, violence, are not always universally shared. So, some obvious examples would be like practices of slavery or caste systems or ritual sacrifice that were once considered morally acceptable in some societies. And we know that when the British, for example, I think in India, when they came across the practice of when the husband died and the wife would be essentially killed because her husband died, they saw that practice as barbaric. And of course, we would all see that as barbaric now. It just highlights, though, that there are definitely different moral systems. And so it becomes a little challenging to really ferret out, how similar are these systems? How different are they? And I do tend to agree with Lewis, though, that there are a lot of things that are very similar. There are some things that are different. So that would be, a criticism that you could definitely look into.
Yeah, it would be interesting to hear Lewis's response to that, right? And I'd have to look through what he laid out in that the abolition of man appendix to see how he handles slavery. I do think ultimately his argument works in a sense if there's just one thing that's always right and one thing that's always wrong. I think at that point it might demonstrate that then that is something above the natural world. If it's always wrong to torture babies for fun or something like that.
Yeah, and I think he also brings up that even he does bring this specifically up in the Nazi example. I hate to bring that up all the time, but that there was something deep within them that knew that what they were doing wrong. So that was his intimation that even if outwardly they were projecting that what they were doing was fine, that there was something deep within them that was telling them that it was not correct. And so that it may be that he's, in a sense, kind of bringing in progressive, some sort of progressive process that our moral intuition changes toward maybe what the ultimate good is. And then that can change over time, and maybe there's something deep seated within all humanity that can sense better values and better systems that would be more moral, and so there may be some progressive nature to this whole project, but that doesn't mean that there is a new moral system that's underlying it. Just maybe we're coming to grips with it more and more with each passing century and millennia.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think he would probably agree with that. That societies don't necessarily align with that moral law. Just the same way that citizens in our country don't always align with our laws. It doesn't mean that the law doesn't exist.
Yeah. And he does give a specific example that just because you can find one individual or an individual here or there that does not seem to be falling in line and being very decent, that doesn't mean that the whole program is undone, that there does not exist a law, so to speak. So just because you have a psychopath out there that is doing crazy stuff, killing people, doesn't mean that you don't have a rule of law in the country that that person lives. It's just that that person doesn't seem to be in touch with that reality. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with that, your sentiments on that. Another criticism would be that the moral law may be explained naturally. This would be one of the big ones that would be used now. So with the advent of evolutionary theory, that, why do we need to go to a moral lawgiver when we can explain it through evolutionary biology and psychology. So this would be something I would see maybe the Weinstein brothers using, big proponents of evolution. And so if these things can possibly explain it, evolutionary biology, psychology, and other naturalistic explanations, and primarily they would explain it because there's some benefit. So there's some benefit to your survival if you're cooperating with other people. So altruism, cooperation, empathy, these somehow have an evolutionary benefit to you, and therefore you're going to do these cooperative behaviors. You're maybe going to structure these laws because, and then in the end, it becomes to your benefit, or it makes the group more survivable. So then the group survives, and so they would kind of focus on this element in that moral institutions or intuitions may arise from social conditioning or cognitive evolution, not a divine source. So their argument would be that natural explanations reduce the need for a supernatural one. And this is going to be one of the ones I think that a lot of people are going to struggle with in our day and age. These kind of arguments are so prevalent, especially from atheists and others, certainly people that are in this evolutionary field, that you can probably explain these or put forth theories anyway that would explain these. And I think the chief exponent of that I've come across are the Weinsteins. And I think they had some good arguments. And so we should be open to them and see what evidence they have. I don't know any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know that Lewis, even though he brings it up, I don't know that he would be entirely against the idea that we have. Well, in fact, I know that he's not entirely against it. He references desires or impulses that we might have that would come from evolution. And Lewis actually talks about evolution quite a bit in Mere Christianity. I was a little bit surprised going through it this second time. He was familiar with those ideas, and I think Lewis was a theistic I think he did believe in evolution. I don't get any indication in the book that he didn't. So he's not coming from a creationist perspective or like a young Earth creationist perspective that wouldn't believe in evolution. He answers the objection by saying, well, we find in ourselves sometimes that we have conflicting desires or impulses, and oftentimes that moral law is appealing to the lesser of the impulses, or maybe it's not even an impulse, but it's just saying to rein in or check this certain impulse is what the moral law would require us to do to be good. And so for him, that works against kind of just the purely evolutionary perspective on that, because presumably evolution would have ironed a lot of that out by now, and we would just go by our strongest impulses would be what's best for us in the tribe.
Yeah, I think he does talk about that the laws are talking about are not, well, he recognizes that evolution has some connection to our base desires, and those base desires may be increasing our survivability, but that the moral law he's talking about sometimes goes against that. Now, I think where somebody like Brett Weinstein would come back with is that there's somehow an evolutionary advantage to self-sacrifice if the group as a whole survives better, because some people within it actually, are sacrificing themselves. So now, but Lewis
would say that it's the weak. If it's the weaker impulse, for him that doesn't make sense through the evolutionary lens.
Yeah.
And then later, I don't think it's this book, then he does ask further questions of, why does it even matter if humanity survives? Or how do you ask a man to give up his life for the sake of his country or tribe? You know, do you have in a purely evolutionary naturalist universe, do you have a foundation to be able to do that?
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges to the evolutionary model of it is that it seems like you're almost in a deterministic way. This person is drawn to self-sacrifice, as if there was no agency in it. Now, a lot of those people don't believe in agency, but it's almost as if they're just drawn to do this, that it has to be a natural thing that just happens in order for the whole community to benefit. When, like you're saying, it's there seems to, and our natural intuition is that this person is voluntarily making the sacrifice against what they would naturally want to do. It wasn't something like they had this something inside their brain that just irresistibly was pushing them towards doing this altruistic act, but rather they were peeing their pants when they're wanting to do this, right? So they're under extreme duress, yet they were able to do something that was very hard, very painful against their natural intuition. So I tend to, buy more into the argument that C.S. Lewis here has. I'm not totally sold on that everything can be explained by evolution. And a lot of the evolutionary theories I've always had a problem with, in that I'm not against evolution per se, but a lot of the things you get from Brett Weinstein are just plausibility theories. So we'll put together, hey, I think this could explain it. But if we know anything from science, and I've done a lot of science, is that just because you can come up with a theory doesn't mean it's true. So you can come up with a lot of explanations for something, and just because you can come kind of with one that kind of makes sense, could be plausible, doesn't mean that that is the truth. There could be a million other ones you could come up with that also make it plausible. And so you have to rely on the scientific method, study, to determine that. And we know evolutionary studies or science is very difficult to do, because they're relying on that these things happen over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and most of us within our mortal time frame cannot possibly do studies of that nature. So I understand the difficulty of doing these studies, but that doesn't make that what they think, or the formulas they come up with, or the theories they come up right, just because it's difficult to study. So my natural inclination, and this is a strong viewpoint from the LDS tradition, actually, is to believe in agency. So we're very anti-deterministic in terms of belief in agency. And of course that doesn't mean it's true either, but my moral intuition is that I have some degree of agency, and that I am making some decisions. I might have full agency, of course, but that there is some element of agency that where I am making actual decisions. And I think the person that does sacrifice themselves without being pushed into it, with having clear opportunities to escape that, is actually making a choice that is not just evolutionary based. That would be my personal bias.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's some of those Methodist roots in the LDS Church.
Absolutely.
The church I grew up in has those roots as well. And I do find, just my experience as a human is that, I do find that I have to do a lot of fighting against my natural impulses. The moral path seems to cut across those quite a bit.
Yeah, precisely. So, well, I think some of the next ones, this one, confusion between descriptive and prescriptive, I'll just go that to the bottom point there. Just because people feel they ought to act a certain way doesn't mean there's an objective law or external source enforcing it. So that is a valid point, that just because you have this ought, this underlying feeling you should do things, or you feel guilty about not doing the right thing, doesn't mean there's an objective law. So there's no direct, necessarily, correlation between the two. There's maybe a false dilemma. So when Lewis moves to there must be a divine lawgiver, philosophers often will argue this is a false dilemma because there could be other explanations. So other types of universal laws. So one example would be Platonic moral realism, where moral truths exist independently of God. And we'll get into this a little later, but this is actually where an LDS belief might come into play. Or there might be secular ethics, so ethics that are divorced from God. Maybe this would be coming into things like what provides the most well-being. So secular ethics would focus on well-being. So what provides the most well-being for the most people? And so that could be another way of framing a kind of universal ethic based on universal well-being. And I think there's some issues with that frame, but I don't know if would go into it today, because that'd be a whole nother long subject to go into. But there are different ways of organizing ethics, and there's even utilitarianism that is another way of framing ethics, virtue ethics. And so Lewis doesn't really hone in on those too much. Of course, these are radio talks. He's not doing an extreme, in-depth look at every possible moral system and saying, oh, this one is the best, of course. But any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, in The Abolition of Man, he is, he really dives into this concept, the book one concept, except for he doesn't really tie it to the existence of God so much. In fact, he calls it the Tao. And his point his goal in The Abolition of Man is not necessarily to use an moral argument to justify the existence of God, but rather to show when humans give up the idea of a transcendent moral law, not just utilitarian or that this is good, it results in less harm, but like an actual law that you could break, that there's a fine for this, that when we abandon that it will lead to very bad consequences in the long run. And that's what The Abolition of Man is talking about, that you have kind of like this priestly class, intellectual class that then rises up. And since they don't believe that there's some higher moral law, that then they start to construct their own law or their own ideas, and that the implementation of those will be the downfall or the abolition of man. So I think Lewis is, in that book, it kind of feels like he's pretty comfortable with the moral law, but not necessarily tying it so tightly to God, like almost in the Platonic sense. And he does have objections for some of those others. Again, bringing it back to, do those have the force to be able to say, it's one thing to say like, yeah, let's have a utilitarian, this just works out for the good for everybody, or the least amount of harm, it sounds nice on paper, but then does it have enough weight for me to be able to tell you, you have to go to war for us and you have to die? Or why does it even matter if humanity continues to exist at all? So, he touches on those, and I haven't heard really convincing answers to those things. I think eventually all of our morality does ground out somewhere. So, for theists, it grounds out at God, or it sounds like maybe in the LDS perspective, like a separate kind of like a moral a law that exists out there, on the level of God, or but eventually it does ground out somewhere. And then atheists and agnostics, I think, tend to say, well, for us it just grounds out in this principle. But I tend to agree with Lewis. I'm not sure just grounding it like that has enough weight for it to function like it needs to in society.
Yeah, no, those are great insights. Looks like I need to go reread Abolition of Man again. Yeah, I do now recall some of that stuff. So yeah, I got to go back and read it as well. These are the couple of the final things that are brought up. One is, this is an obvious one, that Lewis is a Christian, so maybe he has some confirmation bias. So he's going to project Christian assumptions into his observations about moral behavior. And for example, his framing about moral failure, guilt as evidence for sin assumes a Christian framework, rather than questioning whether the sense of guilt has a different origin, like psychological or cultural. So I don't think we need to delve too much in that. I think it's obvious that as a Christian, he's in this book. It's called Mere Christianity. There is a connection from start to end toward there being a God and also Christianity. So, but I think you can't get out of that. There is no person that will not have some bias that they're bringing in, and I think he makes good arguments. But you can always level that argument against him, that somebody from a different tradition is going to say, especially a very different religious tradition, that a lot of the same things could be found within their tradition. And I think I find that a lot from the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, for example, who is doing this Silk Road project where he's inviting people from different traditions to meet, quote, on the Silk Road, and that there might be this common road. It's almost kind of a mere Christianity, but mere Silk Road, where maybe there's these commonalities between different traditions outside of Christianity. And in his case, he would say that he finds that there's no superiority to Christianity in his view. And so there would be a little difference there. Now, Lewis is, of course, not just talking about Christianity. He develops that later on. He is saying that there is a Silk Road, in a sense, in this book, that there is this moral intuition, a type of Silk Road that is going through every nation. So I think there is some things to be aware of there, that he has that bias. And, frankly, some arguments, if you're not in the right headspace, if you're a strict atheist, you may not find that his moral argument for God is convincing. You may be more of the Brett Weinstein type, where you think you can explain it very easily through some sort of evolutionary process. And so, and that it's not logically necessary, that just because you have a moral intuition, it's not forced that there has to be a God. And I think, those are valid arguments. So I think, as you mentioned earlier, oftentimes it'll come to, you mentioned that Lewis had experience. It may be that some of those personal experiences are what, in the end, convince you, not so much that these arguments, they may just leave you open to having those types of experiences and maybe reframing them in a new way. But they may not, for a lot of people, especially in the society we live in, which is frankly anti-God, anti-theist, if you're coming with those prejudices, you may not be so convinced right out of the gate.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, again, I would just say, like, I think Lewis is often approached or criticized as if he's making classical apologetic arguments. And, he is somewhat, but I don't think that's his strength, and I don't think that's what he's primarily doing. So he's not, his strength definitely isn't like analytic philosophy or making an analytical argument that has like these four premises and then an undeniable conclusion that follows from them. He is kind of more like making a case or asking a question. Again, back to the title of the chapter, he puts not a proof for God, but he says as a clue to the meaning of the universe. So it's just a clue. Lewis is asking us to consider, what kind of a universe are we in? What's the nature of the universe? To maybe crack that door open to say that maybe there's more going on than we realize. Like our friend Chris Hanna said, recently. He said, like, in his mind, he can kind of work out that it's just a universe of particles and reactions. But then when he encounters another person, he sees in their face another soul. So I don't think any of us is going to be able to sort out like the nature of the universe just in our minds or figure that out with philosophy. It's I think it is more of a question of what might the universe be, and then if we're willing to opening that door, if we think that God might be there, to open that door and be open to some sort of interaction with that God.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, that's a really good example. And that brings me, I think, a little bit to what is mere Christianity. And when you were talking, it came to me, he talked a little bit about what he defined as mere Christianity, and that was whatever was in the prayer book, I think is what he said. So I don't know what that prayer book was, but something
Probably
from the Anglican Church.
Yeah,
Do you
probably
know
the
more?
Book of Common Prayer.
The Book of Common Prayer, exactly. That's what he was.
Yeah.
That's what he said. And so I'm not familiar with the Book of Common Prayer. I definitely would be curious. I'll have to go look into it further. But there's some set of general beliefs, and I think it's clear from how he frames this whole book that it's probably a Trinitarian formula, and that there's this dualism between materialism and mind. So he actually spends a fair amount of time in this book about materialism being this unconscious pattern of things that just happens without any will or direction, governed by what we call these days, natural laws, versus a mind. And so there's a difference between a different category between mind and material. And so this is a traditional theistic framework that you encounter in Christianity. And so that may be one of the things he's talking about that is more philosophical, kind of a Greek dualism between mind and material. But he's not bringing in all these different theological points that we could disagree about. So there is some philosophy in there, but I agree it's not super in-depth. Now, since it's you and I talking, and you're going to be becoming more probably supporting the traditional view, I wanted to highlight where the Latter-day Saints may disagree a little bit on his underlying framework, especially this dualism between material and mind, and how that might affect what you call mere Christianity. So, because my intuition listening to it is that his definition of mere Christianity is going to be a kind of a classical Trinitarian formulation with some of these Greek philosophical concepts as support, as a kind of a basic framework. And so, I'll go into some of the LDS criticisms or differences, I would say. Not so much criticisms, but maybe some differences. And you highlighted this very interesting point, and this may be where I got some of my interest in C.S. Lewis initially it was certainly just his fantasy novels, but later on, members, as what GPT says here, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints generally respect C.S. Lewis, so I think this is true. I don't think it's wrong on this. And mere Christianity is often recommended in LDS circles for defense of classic Christian principles. But, there are some differences. So even though there are a lot of things we would agree with, I don't personally think that is so devastating that I would throw the book away. But some people could argue that, hey, if you don't agree with this formulation or so forth, that you can't be on the same footing. But I still think we can. But we might go into that later. But I think there's a few points, or more than a few points. And one is that Lewis argues that the moral law or law of human nature is evidence of a divine being external to us. So he talks about somebody behind everything, so underneath, and so like the foundation of everything. And so here's a little difference is that the LDS critique would be that LDS police sees moral law as not something arbitrarily imposed by God, but as an eternal order of the universe. So something even God abides by. So that there's an eternal good and eternal evil, and it's not something that is defined by God. That's kind of an eternal law, you could say, almost like a natural law. And this aligns with teachings that God is perfectly obedient to eternal principles, and it just didn't come up with them willy-nilly. So there seems to be some sort of thing that is universally good outside of even there needing to be an author. And that Lewis's lawgiver argument may seem to flatten the LDS view of divine law as co-eternal. So this would be a little different in that the LDS view is that there are some things that are eternal with God, and some laws would be the same eternality that God has. And so that may be a little different in that Lewis is clearly going to be supporting, I think, that God is the source of law.
Well, yeah, and this is maybe where I might push or challenge the AI a little bit. And I'd also have to reread some of these sections. I don't remember Lewis emphasizing that a lot. And like I said, he actually isn't super critical of that idea of a moral law existing, maybe beside God, or in the case of like the idea of the Tao, kind of independent of specific ideas of God. So, and I don't know that I remember him using this language in Mere Christianity. So I would definitely want to flag that one as a question mark as we go through this to see. Do you know, did he use it in book 1?
Yeah, I think how he puts it is that you have this underlying intuition that people are seeming to reach for when they're having their discussions and disputes, that there seems to be this underlying intuition in that is supporting a moral lawgiver. So that there is this moral lawgiver, that where that's coming from. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that he uses some language like that, but I do agree with you that there could be some subtle nuance there. Now, I think the LDS view would take universal principles of good and evil or moral law as somewhat like a mathematical law. So, does mathematics need God? Or can a 2 plus 2 equal 4 be just as equal whether God exists or not? So they take it in that way, that there are these kind of things that are good on their own and don't require that there's necessarily a giver. They can be supported by the lawgiver. So the lawgiver can influence and say, these are good things and correct principles. Jesus would be one of those, right? So here's a moral teaching that I think you should abide by. And so I'm supporting what my father already gave me. So he's supporting the teaching he would know from his father.
So would it, like, kind of an LDS perspective be that God is kind of like our branches of government, that have various responsibilities of enacting, interpreting, because the United States, its founding principles are kind of on a natural law that's above our country and above these branches of government, but that God would kind of function like the branches of government of making sure that those are implemented. How would you phrase that?
I think we'll get into that a little later. I think there's some elements of that, in fact, very soon here. I think that it's a little tricky because in LDS thought, we don't have dogmatic approaches to everything, very little actually. So what you're relying on is statements from like Joseph Smith, for example, but none of these have become dogma. They're not part of a catechism. It's not something we have to swear by or agree to. But, some general thoughts based on what Joseph Smith has said. in his famous discord called the King Follett Discourse, he said that God saw fit to institute laws whereby fellow intelligences may come to, and I'm extremely paraphrasing here, came to become like him. Now, what the general belief would be that those laws weren't necessarily just from God, but maybe that God was aware and fully utilized those laws, and that's why he was God, that he was 100% attuned and in agreement and in every action and deed, in every way, in goodness and love and beauty, attuned to this natural moral law. But that he saw that there were others around, other intelligent agents that were not familiar or were not abiding that law, and he sought to institute those laws, or otherwise give instruction. Here's your purpose of life, is to become like me, and here are the set of laws that you're going to need to abide by to be like me. And since he's the ultimate, I guess, follower or example or exemplar of those laws, in order to be like him, you would have to follow those same things, if you get my drift.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit kind of like a parent to child relationship, where a parent enforces, like I didn't come up with the moral laws of the universe, obviously, thankfully, but I recognize them and I try and bring my children into alignment with them, and then when they're out of alignment with them, depending on how far out of alignment, I do enforce those laws to some extent. Would LDS, would they say like that God is perfectly aligned with those moral laws?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So in that sense, I don't know, I'm not sure if Lewis would quibble much with that, especially if the LDS conception is that God is aligned with those anyways. And it is interesting that he does talk about the Trinity in Book 4, so he gets into theology quite a bit in Book 4. But I don't think that was part of his original radio talks. And he doesn't locate that at the center of Christianity.
Yeah. No, you put it a lot better than I did. So I'm grateful for your summary of it. Yeah, exactly. So much like I would want to be aligned with the laws of the country, and if I see my children are straying away from the laws, I might instruct them here, in order to be a productive, good citizen and to stay out of trouble, you need to shape up. Here are the laws of the land. You need to stop driving over the speed limit, and so on and so forth. And so he would be the perfect embodiment of the law, much like a mathematical law would exist outside of God. In a certain sense, you can be the perfect embodiment of a law. And so, we would differ a little bit on that point. I don't know, this is a little quibble, I think, on the part of GPT, but a view of human nature, this is a little difference between LDS beliefs, in that we're not as much a believer in the fall, Adam's fall, and that even though my channel is called Adam's Fall, and I'm going to have to do some videos on that. But, Lewis falls in kind of a traditional Christian belief about that there's a fall, of course, and that we're unable to fully live up to the standard that's been set. And where a little difference is the LDS theology, we do not view the fall as entirely negative, but it's a necessary step in God's plan. So we'd affirm that people are born with divine potential and moral agency and not inherently corrupt nature. And I know there's some different interpretations of the fall. So there's definitely, if you go to the Orthodox side of things, they may have a different way of looking at the fall. But the tone of guilt and moral failure that you kind of see a little bit with Lewis, I think this is a small pedantic point, maybe a little overly pessimistic for an LDS audience. But I do think this is a minor thing that is not anything that would be, quote, mere Christianity.
Well,
as far
yeah,
as I can see from Lewis.
Well, maybe. I mean, it may touch on it a little bit, and it would be interesting to flesh that out a little bit because I don't think Lewis was afraid of being kind of heretical in some sense. He definitely speculated a lot, and even in his fiction, in the Space Trilogy, the second book of the Space Trilogy is a what if story if humanity didn't fall. It'd be interesting. I'd be curious to hear an LDS perspective on that book. But so, and I think he presents it, the not measuring up, not so much in like you broke the law and now you're responsible for it. Now pay the fine. So much as an experience. I think he presents it in a later book as kind of an experiential thing. So I guess if someone's experience doesn't align with what Lewis says, I mean that might be good grounds for dismissing what he says. But at least so far, especially the older I get, the more I can relate to what he talks about in the later books.
Yeah, I mean that's good. I think I could give a little more context into the LDS belief in that believe in a premortal existence, and that God, kind of gave people an opportunity, or these intelligences or spirits, however you want to call them, an opportunity to progress and become like Him. So in that context, the fall of Adam or the Garden of Eden has a whole different meaning, because if there was no, quote, fall, this whole plan of God would have been for naught. So you can see where the interpretation of what happened in the Garden of Eden would be more seen as a necessary part of the plan rather than a part that went wrong. Because in the LDS belief, that progression from premortal existence to mortal existence and then beyond, it was all part of the original plan. So it would have been kind of a fortunate fall, is often a term that's used even in Christianity. Now that's not to say that LDS beliefs do not say that there is some aspect of fall that happens to every person. So I happen to believe there is. And I think anybody who witnesses a child, or as children, or was a child, knows that at some point you go from this state of innocence and then you have a fall of some sort. You become cognizant of your weakness, your nakedness. You do something bad, and you start to get a cognitive realization of what that means in terms of negative consequences. You, quote, want to hide, like they put on skins, right? And so there is this kind of almost duality within LDS belief, in that it's kind of part of the plan, so it's a fortunate fall in some ways, but there is the reality of the human experience that is, I think, recognized in that story, that is part of every human's experience. So it's not like we totally are not aware of that. I happen to, believe that myself. So it's just a little subtle nuance that I think is a little different. Now, you were talking earlier about what is God's role, and so Lewis would refer to more of a universal moral law written into human nature that points toward God, but LDS doctrine teaches that all people are influenced, quote, by the light of Christ. Now, the light of Christ is something you find in LDS scripture, but it's not unique to LDS scripture. The term, I think, predates Joseph Smith. And so this, quote, light of Christ is what gives you a sense of right and wrong. And so this may overlap with Lewis's law of nature, but we might wish that Lewis had clarified the spiritual source of this inner guidance rather than treating it primarily as a philosophical clue. Now, I think that Lewis is trying to, in this book, trying to appeal to a certain audience and make it more, let's say, not as just relying on Christian terms and trying to make it as universal. Maybe an atheist or a scientist could read it, and it's not going to be, I have to know what the light of Christ is, and that would bring a whole another set of set of bags to the whole thing that you'd have to, you know, try to unravel. So,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
in other words, God is through the Spirit. Now, the Spirit would be another word for this, right? So, light of Christ or the Spirit would be God's influence. So, God would be through the Spirit, or this term light of Christ. Basically, you know, how Christ is, that Spirit of Christ would be emanating from God. His influence over the universe would be something like this. So, you know, that word spirit is, of course, a very complicated word, but I do think in the right way it could be in some way how God's influence is permeating the universe, and this underlying gnawing we have when we do something wrong, or when we talk to others, is this influence, or these laws. But also, not only the laws are there, but that God has some way to amplify that, so to speak. So
Yeah,
I don't know if you've come across that term or not.
well, I've heard the term. I don't know if it was in my LDS wanderings or where
Yeah.
I first heard that term. But it is interesting how Lewis avoids philosophical language. He avoids theological language. He doesn't even talk about the Trinity using the term Trinity. And he really doesn't quote scripture in Mere Christianity hardly at all. So I mean, he does a pretty good job of bringing things down to just like an everyday kind of level.
Kind of the human level, and just your experience tells you these intuitions are there, and can he bring out some points that help you see something deeper from that human experience? Exactly. So, you know, maybe an insufficient role for agency. Latter-day Saint theology is very high in agency. In fact, we chose to come to Earth. So even from the pre-existence, there was a chance to choose not to. And I'm not, I don't want to focus too much on that. I think that's a tiny point. Also, this underdeveloped view of premortal life. Of course, Lewis is going to have an underdeveloped view of premortal life. There's not too many people in the Christian tradition that really have much of a view about this. So I think the Latter-day Saints would be more unique in this. So I don't want to focus too much on those two things. I think those are not so critical. But I think this part here, and I asked ChatGPT to clarify, because it didn't bring up this point earlier, in that in chapter 4, what lies behind the law, Lewis lays out two competing worldviews. And this could be significant in terms of the mere Christianity. One is the materialist view that the universe and everything in it, including humans, arose by chance. So this is kind of the classic materialist view. Through physical causes, consciousness, morality, and meaning are byproducts of material processes. Now, he spends a good amount of time contrasting that in that chapter with the religious view, which he calls the theist view, that there is a mind or intelligence behind the universe, and the moral law suggests this mind cares about right and wrong. So there's this dichotomy, or this duality between the material and mind, and that he focuses on that kind of like an idealism, that the mind is primary. So idealists have that view as well. So that is something you'll come across in circles today as well, that the mind is primary. And Lewis concludes that the existence of a universal moral law is best explained by a mind behind the universe, not by blind matter. And this leads to Lewis's moral argument for God. If moral law exists and it's not material, then something immaterial, a mind, must exist beyond nature. So this is where an interesting divergence, I think, would happen. So LDS thought is that rejects the radical divide. So this is, I think, significant between spirit and matter that Lewis assumes in his dichotomy. So Doctrine and Covenants, which is some Latter-day Saint additional scripture, it says there is no such thing as an immaterial matter. All spirit is matter, but is more fine or pure. So what does that mean? Well, that's a tough one. But you could go with what ChatGPT says here, that materialism is not necessarily atheistic or anti-spiritual, because spirit is a refined form of matter. God's spirits or even resurrected beings exist physically, just with a more refined, exalted form of matter. And that critique would be that Lewis's contrasts may rely too heavily on a Greek-influenced dualism that doesn't align with LDS metaphysics. So now what would I say is that the LDS view, if I was to put it another way, would be that mind does not exist without material, and material without mind of some sort. So anytime you have an agentic agent, there would be materiality would be co-eternal with that agentic agent. Now the question is, what is that material? Well, a lot of people that are skeptics of LDS thoughts on this just think it's the crude flesh that you and I have. But we would more point to the resurrection of Jesus as the model for materiality, in that Jesus could walk through walls, right? Could just show up in the midst of the apostles, but yet he could be touched, right? He could eat. So this materiality doesn't mean that it's the material you and I can see or feel. And we, of course, know from modern science that there's all sorts of, quote, materiality that we can't see. And if you reduce matter to smaller and smaller particles, most of those things we cannot comprehend. Even a dog can hear a lot more of the audio universe than we can hear. And so this non-dualism between mind and matter would be actually a difference, in that we don't believe that mind can exist without materiality. So they would be coexistent. And this would actually be more consistent with what a traditional science these days would teach or believe, I guess, that the mind doesn't exist separate from the body. Now, we wouldn't necessarily say that the physical human body that we have right now, that the mind can't exist separate from that, but that some material form, whether that's highly reducible in some form, would be part of any mind. So that is a little difference. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I have a few questions. So, in the LDS conception, well, let me. My first question would be, when it talks about all spirit is matter, but is more fine or pure. What are the speculations in the LDS world on what that means?
Well, it would be kind of like what I mentioned earlier, in that there would be gradations of matter. I like to use the scientific terms of, we can reduce matter to smaller particles, right? So, and then you get to things like X-rays and gamma rays, things that can even penetrate us, go through us, yet we cannot comprehend those or with our physical senses. So, you get down to things like electrons and neutrons and protons and on down the line, in that I think a lot of scientists that are LDS kind of think in that vein, that you're getting to smaller and smaller, you're getting to quantum mechanics, you're getting to all these things underlying quantum energy. And so this materiality could, it's hard to kind of put into words, but finer or pure, a lot of people speculate those are kind of things that we would use to describe what that means. But we would still, and I think a materialist would still say that some form of existent matter or energy or something. Something is active in the world and has consequences, can be measured, that kind of thing. And so that would be a little difference, in that we don't think there is some mind that was alone at some point in line with nothing around it, just pure mind, which I think is what idealism would say, in that there was no connection to any material element combined with that. And so, a little difference for sure, I think.
And so I guess another question would be, I think I follow that. Like it's like there's just like different types of things in the physical universe, and that God is made or made of a different type of one of those things. But there are perhaps some things that we can't yet measure, and these would, or maybe we could. Well, I don't know, or we don't understand what we're seeing. I'm not sure how you would parse that out with like the Holy Ghost or something like that. But presumably the Holy Ghost could be measured at some point or seen.
Well, I think if you use a scientific way of looking at the Holy Ghost, it would be more like the radiation from the sun or something, right? Something that permeates the whole universe and fills the entire universe, something like that. Some energy, or, of course, the sun, we're used to visible light, but you could more have radiation things that this would all be giant speculation, but some sort of influence, and we know that energy and light and all these things influencing the earth where we stand. We wouldn't live without the sun's energy and light, right? So something of that nature could be possibilities, but I think this would be speculation. But basically it comes down to that matter, or you could say the universe and God are co-eternal.
Yeah.
That they exist simultaneously. So where a mind exists, it's going to be simultaneously co-eternal with some sort of materiality, in that it cannot be totally stretched apart.
And so then how does the moral law fit into this? Because you said it doesn't flow, in the LDS conception, doesn't flow from God as a lawgiver. So how does that exist in the completely material universe?
Well, I would say that you have to have an agentic agent for a moral law to make any sense, right? So there has to be something for the law to act upon, some agent to act upon. And the agentic agents, or those things that can make decisions, that's where the law would come into being. Now, you might ask, well, where does the laws of mathematics come from? Where are they materialized from? They just seem to be there, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the issue you get with both Latter-day Saint Christian and atheist conceptions of the cosmos, at some point you have to rely on some sort of divine miracle, right? Some beginning miracle. And for traditional Christianity, it would be that, there's this God outside of space and time that's underlying everything. For Latter-day Saints, and I think this would be the same with a lot of scientific views, that there are the underlying rules of reality that are just there, in some sense. So, and then it's the agentic agents that begin to be able to measure or comprehend these physical laws and moral laws. So
the LDS perspective sounds very much, correct me if I'm wrong, but like very friendly to kind of a natural law perspective, like this.
Yes.
As there are, beings with agency, that any time that exist, they work best. They work best following certain principles, and that I'm trying to think of where it becomes right or wrong. Does it become right? Is the right or wrong bound up in that? Just like, how moral beings work best? Or is that where God comes in, where God's like, you work best under these these conditions. Like if you're just all murdering each other, that's not going to work. And like I feel like to have some sort of right or wrong, you do need an enforcement or someone to say, like, not just that this is a worse way to live, but it's actually a wrong way to live.
Yeah.
That you almost need a third party, I guess, is maybe what what I'm stumbling to articulate.
Yeah. Well, I think in Joseph Smith's conception, it was God found himself in the midst of other intelligences and has sought to institute laws whereby they may become like him. So, in other words, it's if you want to become like me and have what I have, here's the laws you need to abide by.
I see.
Because
Yep.
I will not tolerate any degree of uncleanliness, right? In other words, the same sociality, the same type of person that you are. You could use a Trinitarian formulation, the love between individuals, the same love and goodness that I have and exemplify. If you want to be exist where I am and be part of what I am, these are the laws you have to follow. Now, they may not be that I'm the originator of all these laws, but where I am, there you can be also if you follow and are like me. And, that's, I think, a lot of what you see in thoughts about heaven and hell and where we go after we die. And are we in a permanent hell, or can people make change and stuff like that? Or is it their own conscience, their own desire not to be with God that is actually their own hell? And so you can kind of see that in that formulation that some of that is what we're talking about, in that your own decision not to adhere to God's law is what keeps you out. So the same way you are, the same sociality, the same belief, you don't permit yourself to be with God because essentially you're not agreeing to abide by his law and be like him because of whatever personal hang-ups or issues you might have. And so you can decide to essentially live your own law and have your own reward, right? So it's not like God is forcing you to say, hey, you have to abide by my law, or how I live, or the glory and the blessings I might be able to give you. You could follow your own path, go do your own thing, and suffer whatever consequences of that may be. So does that give you more detail or kind of answer?
Yeah, in our brief conversation, I mean, it's such a big topic and it's so complicated. I think we would do better as people in our philosophy and our theology to exercise like some epistemic humility and to realize like I'm asking you questions about like the moral law of the universe and the nature of God and how those interplay with each other and like these grand philosophical ideas. I think it's just good to admit, and I think Lewis would admit this, and I admit this for sure, that like a lot of this stuff is speculation, and it doesn't mean that there isn't a truth to be found or had or known, but also I have to keep in mind that I'm just a peon of an ant with such a narrow perspective on anything, and even the Bible, like as a Protestant, I would go back to the Bible a lot. Even that's a confusing book with lots of different ideas. So
yeah, and I think those are great points, and I agree with you. So I'm using this as more just an interesting thing to see where there may be some differences. But I think I'm going to come back to that observation you made a little later. Maybe how I would, maybe how what we could call mere Christianity, where these things are not an issue, per se. And so, but maybe just unless you had any final things to say on that.
No, I do agree with you. I think where he's going is not to sort out that question
Yeah, I
of
think
all.
this is just kind of interesting, where
Yeah,
some
definitely.
differences are. Not that I'm trying to proselytize you and say this is the truth necessarily, but because it's such a focus of that chapter, the mind and materiality, it's an obvious, interesting point to talk about. So, Lewis frames the material world as either a blind mechanism or creation, or the creation of a divine mind. But the LDS nuance would be the material world is not just a backdrop or a fallen place. So this is definitely different for some elements of Christianity. It's a sacred realm where God's children gain bodies, learn, and progress eternally. So I don't think this is totally divorced from a lot of Christian elements, but we definitely don't see the body or materiality as evil. Now, this is kind of a Gnostic element I think I see sometimes in a lot of Christians is if you get where you kind of almost see materiality or the physical as evil, and the purpose is to escape to this divine mind kind of thing, and because you're kind of escaping your body. But the LDS conception is there's no shame in being material beings, obviously, since we believe everything has some materiality to it, whatever that is. And the resurrection is the example of this that we would look to, that it affirms the eternal union of the spirit and body. Now, this physical materiality that Jesus exemplified is what we would use as an example of what that could look like. But we definitely are not, we're sometimes accused, I've actually been accused on Twitter, on X, of that Mormons are Gnostic. And of course, Gnostics believe that the body was evil. You're trying to escape your body, right? Well, it's definitely different than the LDS. We believe everything's material, and we're definitely not Gnostic in that way, for sure. And so maybe Lewis's framing may underplay the positive theological role of matter and embodiment, and that's because of the emphasis on the mind being primary rather than equally eternal. Now, I mentioned also the moral law and the light of Christ. And so this is that we believe the light of Christ is given to all people to discern good from evil. So there's this, the light is not just evidence of God's existence, but an active influence of God in the world. So I don't know if Lewis would disagree with that God has some active influence for sure. Now, that being said, all of this I think is just interesting because it highlights some of my unique background that would come into play when we're talking about materiality and mind and moral laws. But Joseph Smith also said that everything was appendage to that Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected on the third day. So, although this is these things are interesting, and there's going to be differences between the Latter-day Saints and classical theism, Joseph Smith's focus, and he always preached this, that the Jesus was the guiding light for every Christian, and that everything else was secondary. So secondary to that, we believe that Jesus was the ultimate example of what the divine would be as somebody living on earth and who we should follow. And that's kind of is the mere Christianity that I'm thinking about, that there is the life of Jesus and being his disciple that is, in my mind, the mere Christianity. I think Lewis would agree with that, that is disciples of Christ and following his example and trying to emulate him, and also realizing, I think, even though there is in some of what we discussed, this LDS belief in agency and that we can progress, we would also say that we're going to fall short, that there's no human besides Jesus that could live the way he lived, and that we will be reliant on Jesus to go the extra step through divine grace. And then there's another misconception about Latter-day Saints, is that think we can become gods of our own volition and our own progress and of our own will, separate from God and Jesus. We definitely do not believe that. It's only in and through the grace and of Jesus and God that we're able to progress and become more like them. And as Paul talks about becoming joint heirs, we become heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. That's only possible in and through Jesus and his atonement and becoming like God. So it's not like there's this there, although there's this emphasis on progress toward God. It's not in of our ourselves only. Of course, we play a synergistic role. I would say more like what the Orthodox believe, that we're not totally divorced from that process. There is a transformational process, and we're involved in that. But that being said, that I think, despite these differences, I think there is a mere Christianity, and I think that's what you're trying to find, and what this book is trying to find, and it is perhaps even more mere than what Lewis is talking about here, in some sense, because even below these philosophical debates, there may be yet another level below that, where even though we might disagree on materiality and mind, that there is yet a moral law, and that Jesus was the example on earth of somebody attuned to that moral law. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it'll be interesting as we get into what Lewis sees as mere Christianity. I think this might be a little bit controversial. I think it's a little bit in opposition to some of the common teachings in the evangelical church. Now, there's not just one evangelical church. There's multiple evangelical churches with different teachings and, different theologies, and then, the broader Protestant world as well. And then in mainstream Christianity, Catholic and Orthodox, even outside of that, there's a lot of different groups. But there was definitely kind of some common teachings I heard about if you were to ask someone in the church I grew up in, or a Southern Baptist church, or a few different evangelical circles, what is mere Christianity? You might get a certain answer if you ask a Lutheran or a Calvinist, and it'd be interesting it's going to be interesting to see how what Lewis says, how well it aligns with those common answers that you hear today. So I do think, spoiler alert, it is a little bit different.
Yeah, I think what we hear as Latter-day Saints often, and you've probably, since you've been in the Latter-day Saint world a little bit, is that we're not mere Christianity because we're not a Trinitarian, essentially. So because we don't have that particular belief, that we're not Christian. In fact, I think that exact thing from a comment on one of my YouTube videos just today. So, I think, though, that I would say, and I think Latter-day Saints would say, that there's another level below that belief, or above, or whatever you want to characterize it, that transcends that belief, that would still encapsulate Christianity. And my personal thought would be that as somebody who's a disciple of Christ that's attempting to follow Jesus, and in the best way they know how, and realizing that they will ever be falling short, will be reliant on grace at some point. So that would be how I would characterize it. But I do look forward to how C.S. Lewis will continue to develop this in future books, and even despite this little disagreement on how we would frame existence and where laws come from, I'm not going to say that would totally disrupt the project of mere Christianity that Lewis is going to develop further in this book.
Well, and he gets, again, more spoiler alerts, he gets pretty brutal. If you go into mere Christianity hoping that Lewis is going to present your set of theological beliefs or your philosophical beliefs, and that if you align with them, if you checkbox identify as this, this, and this, that it's your theological and philosophical identifications that make you a Christian, like you're in for a brutal surprise. Lewis is pretty harsh on himself and harsh on like our motivations, and he gets way deeper like into the heart state of things. And in fact, if I could I read a quote real quick from the end of chapter 5? So at the end of all of his chapters, he does such a good job of just putting things in like a pithy little statement. So if you're reading through Mere Christianity, like pay attention to the last lines. But let's see, where do I start at the end here? All I am doing is to ask people to face the facts, to understand the questions which Christianity claims to answer. And they are very terrifying facts. I wish it was possible to say something more agreeable, but I must say what I think true. So he's forcing people to, like, hey, look, like, pay attention to truth, but then he's going to indict us here. Of course, I quite agree that the Christian religion is, in the long run, a thing of unspeakable comfort. But it does not begin in comfort. It begins in the dismay I have been describing, and it is no use at all trying to go on to that comfort without first going through the dismay. In religion, as in war and everything else, comfort is the one thing you cannot get by looking for it. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth. Only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. Most of us have got over the pre-war wishful notion about international politics. It is time we did the same about religion.
Yeah, I really like that. I was listening to that today, so that's great. Yeah, and I think that's very, very true. If you are looking for comfort, I think that's kind of a hallmark of a lot of people's journeys in their lives today. Is they go on ventures to find themselves. They may travel all the world looking for this comfort, for this inner anxiety they have, disease or uneasiness, or they may be seeking various things to ameliorate that underlying issue that they have, what he might be talking about in this deep-seated moral universe that is calling to us. But the more you try to seek those things, the more try to find yourself. Paradoxically, it's almost like what Jordan Peterson would say, that when you're kind of selfish, you're trying to heal yourself. It's all about yourself. You actually become a lot more miserable. And it's when you're looking for something deeper, these deeper truths that, they can be painful too. Because when you face deeper truths, that can be really test yourself, especially if it's truths about who you are, right? Then short term that may be painful, but long term that can provide you more, for sure. So,
well, it's more comfortable to be the own judge of our lives and be able to say innocent, good, like make excuses for ourselves. It's uncomfortable if there is someone or something beyond us, and if we don't align with that, then that does become uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. Did you have any other final thoughts on book 1?
No, I appreciated hearing some of the LDS perspective on those. It would be I kind of tempted to read through chapter 4 again in light of that. So I appreciate hearing that.
Yeah, and I think as we go through this set of books, I think I'll try to not be bashful about bringing out those things where we might disagree, because he's coming from more of a classical Christian frame, and so there will be throughout the books little differences, but I don't think they're going to be things that will derail the whole project, because I do believe in that frame of mere Christianity. I do think that it exists, and I it's one of the sorrowful things when I have interactions with people where it seems all about determining who falls under the name, So it's all about the term, like nominalism, instead of, well, what is this person's character? Do they emulate Christ? Are they following him in a way I would, if I just met them on the street, I would say, wow, that's a Christian person. And but if then I found out later that they go to this denomination or that, then I'd be like, oh, they're from the devil, right? When the 10 minutes before I thought they were the most angelic person that I ever met, right?
Yeah.
So I think that project that I know you're interested in is to break down barriers and to see all sorts of people fall within this mere Christianity, and how to define that we can all come more unified into a single body is one I share, and not be so putting up so many barriers, and more seeing where we have commonality and goodness and love, shared between each other.
Yeah, and I think the label part is way less important than actually being in Christ and found in Christ, whatever that means. He does. Like I just finished the fifth book, so the final book, I just finished it. So he does really get into what that looks like on the human personal level. And just an anecdote, I'd followed this YouTube channel called Catholic Verses, where a Catholic gentleman interviewed a bunch of people, and one of the people that he interviewed, she was just so, there was kind of a light about her. There was something that seemed alive and real in her faith and how she lived, kind of that one of those things. And I think Lewis describes this in the fifth book. One of those things of like, oh, I want what she has. Whatever she has, I want. That's great, And I found out at the end of the interview that she attended an LDS church. So that was really cool. And I found that in lots of different places, whether it's, Catholics, or I don't know as many Orthodox, but, I think that God, through Jesus, God in Christ, can reach people wherever they're at, and he does so in surprising ways. And I think thankfully it's something more exciting and inspiring than just what label we wear. So
yeah, and totally agree. I'm in the healthcare industry, and I work with people all day long of different faiths, and I'm in the South, so I'm in a territory where there's a lot of Protestants and Baptists, and when I come across people of different faiths, I'm like, wow, this is a real genuine Christian person, and it's my hope that we can get rid of the labels as much, and the judgments related to those things, and just see people and know them for who they are, and known as you're known, kind of as Jesus said, you'll know him and see him as he is, and vice versa. And I would say that's true for a lot of people of different religions altogether. And so I see the charity and goodness they have, and as well. So I think that's a good place where we might wrap up. Any other thoughts?
Well, it's just the final thought that's kind of aligned with all this is LDS had some roots in Methodism, and the Nazarene Church had some roots in Methodism, and John Wesley was the founder of Methodism, and his story is just fascinating, and I think actually very much aligned with mere Christianity, with what Lewis experienced and talked about. But he went to be a missionary as part of the Anglican Church to North America, and encountered a group of people who weren't part of his tribe on the boat trip over. I think they were Moravians, maybe. And there was something about the way that they were, not their theological commitments or philosophical commitments, that made him kind of be like, ooh, I want what they have. So he says that he went to save other people as a missionary, but realized that he himself needed saving. And so then he comes back to England and starts the journey of kind of asking that question of like, how do I become saved? Even though he was already had the label, was under the in the right camp, so to speak, but it's that journey of like, how do I become saved and become aligned with God? So
Yeah, that's a great anecdote. So, well, everybody, we'll finish up here today and join us for the next episode. We'll go to part 2, which will be, book 2. And then I think there's 4 parts or 4 books. So we'll conclude in 4 parts, and we'll see you in the next episode.